Okay, so a bit of a primer on neuromarketing. You know, when we talk about market research, and neuromarketing is a subsection of that, we think of the traditional market research methods like your focus groups. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And these are great. These have been around for a very long time. The challenge with a lot of focus groups is that you can often have one person skew the opinion of the other people in the room, or you can have the group effect where people tend to agree with each other just to basically say what they think the marketer wants to hear. So I sat behind the glass at a couple of these research sessions, and I always felt that there was something more behind what people were meaning to say and what they were actually saying. And another very popular form of research nowadays is conducting surveys. And the challenge with this form of research I found was you have to really know how to pose a question, because the way you ask a question will influence the answer you're going to get. So there are some limitations here. At the very core, these research techniques rely on a person's ability to identify how they're feeling and then to be able to express how they're feeling. And we know now from science that is pretty hard to do. So, Henry Ford figured it out a long time ago. He said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So this got me thinking as well. There has to be a way to get beneath the surface to understand how people truly feel. As a marketer, I had a lot of data about who my customers were and what they were buying, but I was missing the other component. I didn't really understand why they were doing what they were doing. And in order to do that, I had to dive deeper. And so I looked to neuroscience. And when we look at neuroscience, this is Rene Descartes, who back in the 1600s said, I think, therefore I am. And that was largely misinterpreted as the human being as a logical creature that makes decisions based on all available information. And so the paradigm at the time, the neuroscience paradigm, was started with thinking and then moving into action, meaning we are logical creatures, so therefore what we think guides what we do. And since then, we have learned a lot more about the brain. We have ways of looking at the brain without physically opening up and holding a brain. We can actually see it in action thanks to the technologies we have available today. So what we now know is actually the opposite. It's feelings that guide our actions, not so much our logical thinking or our neocortex, which you're going to find out in a little bit. So this is Antonio Damasio. He wrote a book in 2010 called Descartes' Error, which is a very interesting read. And the premise of the book is that emotions are a key input into rationality. And why is that? It's always good to understand a little bit of the anatomy before talking about the reasons and the applications of this research. So when we look at our brains, we're, men, women, we have the same brain structures. We use them differently, but when we have sensory information coming in from the outside, so all your five senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, comes in through the core of the brain and moves outwardly towards the top of the brain. And the top of the brain is what we call your neocortex or your new brain. And all this information moves outwardly towards that region in order for you to make decisions, to plan your day, to speak, to think rationally, and so on. So this is the last piece in the evolutionary timescale to have evolved. Now, you're going to notice the middle area that these signals are passing through is what we call the limbic system or the middle brain. And this middle brain is really the core of emotion. This is where a lot of our gut feelings happen. This is where our fight or flight happens. So these are automatic responses that we don't really have to think too much about. So when any stimuli from the outside, be it a website, a TV commercial, your spouse calling your name, or whatever it may be, or a fragrance, it enters through the core of your brain and moves outwardly, but it goes through the emotional brain. So there's no way to communicate to the logical brain without going through the emotional brain. And this is simply based on our anatomy. So what we now know is that logic is just the tip of the iceberg. This is the obligatory iceberg slide, but really it's the emotion that drives action. So when we look at measuring emotion, we look for certain triggers. And I want to tell you a little bit of a story about a study that was done with 600 women who were given an empty Tiffany's box to hold. The logo was not on the box. It was just that color, that robin blue egg color. And they were told to simply hold the box. And their biometrics were measured. What they found is their heart rate went up by 20% just from holding an empty blue box. And that's kind of cool because, you know, we now understand that brands are a shortcut towards a reward. And in this case, the reward in the woman's mind is, you know, engagement, marriage, children, and so on. So there's all these emotions that occur when this particular color is being presented. And that's, you know, it made their heart rate go up by 20%. So when we look for emotional triggers, that is an interesting one. We also look for other things as well. For example, motion. So this is the reason why ads on buses work, because we're designed from an evolutionary perspective to look out for things that are going to harm us, that go by really fast. So for example, you place an ad on a bus that you add the element of motion. Or, for example, novelty, which is a new way of describing a product or a new way of looking at an old staple, something like Lego blocks. And then there's dissonance. And I'm pretty sure that's not a Heineken commercial, but it kind of it conveys the point of an image that makes you look twice, something that makes you do a so-called double take. So this could be something like the Old Spice guy or, you know, that commercial, I think, from a year or 2 years ago. Or something that makes you really question what it is you're looking at. That's another emotional trigger that our brain does not spend too much time processing, that occurs pretty naturally. And these are the things we're interested in measuring. So if there's one thing that you're going to take away today, or tweet, or write down, let it be this. People may say what they think, but they're going to act on how they feel. And this is why the field of neuroscience is so important now to business. And how do we go about measuring these things? Well, I'll start by telling you a little bit about the technologies, and I'll give you some examples about how these technologies are being used today. The term neuromarketing, first of all, was coined back in 2002. So it's not a very old term. I think it just made dictionary.com. And it basically refers to the application of neuroscience technologies to solving marketing challenges. So when we talk about neuroscience tools, we have neuroscience tools and then we have biometrics tools. And these are two main buckets, I would say, under the neuromarketing umbrella, so to speak. So obviously we know that neuroscience refers to measuring the brain, and biometrics refer to measuring the body in general. And since the brain directs the body, what we like to do is always combine a neuroscience metric with a biometrics measure. So we have tools like the EEG that are available these days. So the EEG is the electroencephalogram. That was technology developed, well, back in the 60s. It used to be like a swimming cap with a lot of wires coming out of it, and nowadays it's a lot more friendly looking. It's wireless and a lot easier to use. And because of its portability, it's often the tool of choice for a lot of companies who are looking to understand how their customers feel. The next best neuroscience tool available is the fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. And this measures changes in blood flow in the brain. And we'll talk about these in a little bit in more detail as well. The fMRI is a tool that you'd want to use when you're conducting a very large campaign, or when you really want to know and be able to predict what people are going to do with a lot more accuracy. And the EEG tells you that to a degree. However, the fMRI is a lot more accurate in predicting what people are going to do. When it comes to biometrics, we have a couple of tools. We have actually quite a few. We like to use eye tracking quite often in combination with EEG. Obviously, eye tracking measures pupil dilation, so that way you see where people are looking on a screen, when maybe they're navigating a mobile application or when they're outside looking at billboards. The eye tracking usability applications are really endless, and it's a very important biometric that tells us quite a lot about what grabs visual attention. Another way to measure how people react is using facial coding, and this is a tool. It's a software that is being used through the person's webcam. The participant activates their webcam, and the software basically measures their facial features and changes in expression to be able to determine what specific emotional states that person is feeling. Facial coding is quite scalable, meaning you can run it over, hundreds or maybe thousands of people. Every one of these tools has its limitations and its best areas where it should be applied. But I want to make you aware of what is out there. And of course, there's heart rate, which straightforward measures the increase or decrease in heart rate, and skin response, which is sometimes called galvanic skin response, measures skin conductivity. So whether you're sweating more than usual or whether your skin is fairly dry, it's an indication of arousal as well. So some of the tools that are available that you may have heard about, this is a predictive eye tracking tool. It's a software that analyzes images and predicts areas of visual focus. So here we don't have people actually wearing eye tracking glasses. This is a software, right? So you input an image and it tells you where people are most likely to look based on what we know about the visual system. And we know a lot about the visual system, actually. It's the most well understood system in the brain. So things like contrast or shape or faces are much more likely to attract attention. And the correlation also between the software and actual eye tracking studies is quite high these days. So if you only have a very small budget, using a software like this is ideal because it gives you an idea of where people are most likely to look. You get to learn what is likely to be seen and what is likely to be missed. And ultimately, you have a much better understanding of visual awareness. This is a quite popular example of an eye tracking study for sunsilk. And in this particular situation, the areas that are more red are areas of more visual focus versus greenish or yellowish, which are not really areas where people were looking. It's interesting to see how when the model's face is looking straight ahead, people are most likely to look at the content above it, and obviously at her face. We're designed actually to look at faces before, spotting shampoo bottles. So a person looking straight at you will grab your attention. And sometimes in some advertisements, a face may compete with a product, such as here, where the product itself does not get any visual attention. However, when you make a small modification in shifting where her eyes are looking, you can now see that the brain is a lot more interested in, what is she looking at? So the eye is drawn to the bottle this time, and obviously to her face, the actual product, and to the content above it. So this is just to illustrate the point that you can make small changes and get quite significant results. Now, when we're talking about combining neuroscience with a biometric, I mentioned we tend to use EEG and eye tracking. And the reason for that is because if you just do eye tracking alone, you get an understanding of where people are looking. And oftentimes, the way I see it is you can look at a picture of a train wreck, for example, for a very long time, but it does not necessarily mean that you like what you're looking at. So we want to know if people are focusing in one area, what are they actually feeling at the same time? Are they spending a lot of time on this package or on this website because they're liking what they're reading, or is it because they're confused and they're just going over the content or the image to try to make sense of it? And so combining these two metrics, the metrics coming from the eye tracking and the EEG gives us that full picture. The EEG tells us about brain activity. It tells us whether someone's paying attention, whether they're bored, whether they're motivated by what they're looking at. And obviously, eye tracking measures visual focus. Ultimately, we get metrics of emotional engagement, mental attention, and when a person is highly engaged and paying attention, we have noticed that that has a correlation with the perceived quality and value of that product that they're looking at. So we want to make sure that they're spending the time on the right items, and they are actually experiencing positive emotional engagement with what they're looking at. When we conduct this research in store, and obviously this can be taken out into the world, you can do these studies in a store or on a mobile device or on a computer. It looks something like this. So the person's wearing a headset, which is, it feels like headphones kind of. It's wireless. And they're able to wear the eye tracking glasses as well, so we can see where they're looking, and they're walking around and experiencing the world, or they're following maybe a script. If we tell them you have to go out and buy so and so, they go out and do that, and we see along the way what captured their attention and what they're noticing. When we take this data back, this is a visualization of what this data looks like in the lab, so to speak. We can tell the difference between someone paying attention and someone who is, well, I call it at rest or spacing out, if you will. If in this particular example, the person on the left is told just to relax, and the person on the right is told to perform a math equation. So you can see the difference in brain activity when someone is really focused and working at doing something, and when someone's relaxing. So neuromarketing has been used extensively over the last 10 years or more. One interesting example comes from Campbell's, where using neuroscience, they have redesigned their packaging. They have moved their logo to the bottom. They found that the spoon with the actual soup in it, if you look at the old label, the spoon had no emotional engagement, and instead what they did, they updated the bowl and added vapors to make it look more emotionally engaging. And instead of putting the logo at the bottom, now at the top we have the different varieties of soups that are available. So this was a lengthy process with testing along the way, but the newer product is performing a lot better. And if you go to the stores, you're going to see them looking like this nowadays. And I don't think there's any labels like the old one available anymore. So I'm going to play 2 videos for you, and I hope they're going to come through. But what we're going to do is I want to show you how obvious, or maybe not so obvious, the difference is between a commercial that is successful or that is easy to understand and more likely to be shared, and a commercial that is perhaps not so engaging. So you're going to watch 2 commercials, and then I'm going to ask you which one you think is the most emotionally engaging.
So this performance basketball is another way Bridgestone is bringing its tire technologies to the world of sports.
You got it. Same Serenity technology that absorbs road noise to runs at it's being tested. Jim Duncan and Steve.
So how exactly would this revolution be named?
It's quiet.
What's that?
Bridgestone's at Bridgestone for performance knows.
Did that come through okay? The audio didn't come through? Okay. So the second commercial, you may have seen this one.
The drivers most out of their car.
Okay, so between the sleeping baby commercial and the beaver commercial, which one do you think had the highest emotional engagement when tested with EEG? Everyone agrees with beaver? Okay, great job. What we noticed is actually that there were peaks during the commercial where peaks of emotional engagement where I think obviously when the beaver was avoided, when the person sees that the bridge went out, and then at the very end, it's interesting to see how certain aspects of the commercial had a higher emotional impact than other aspects. And sometimes it's around action, sometimes it's around humor. But what this particular commercial did compared to the previous one is it not only was it really simple and straightforward, so quite obvious to pick out that this was the better one, but it ended on a high note as well, which is an important aspect when you're conducting, when we conduct research, we notice from a neuroscience perspective, when you end on a high note, you tend to have a better overall engagement. So I want to tell you another story about a study we did using EEG and eye tracking. This time it was to uncover from mobile applications. So this was done last year in partnership with Plastic Mobile with three applications: Pizza, Best Buy, and Hyatt. And what we wanted to see is for the first time, actually, at that time, we wanted to understand how can you design a better m-commerce experience, and how can you make sure that you reduce hurdles so that people are able to use m-commerce apps a lot easier and obviously use them more often. So what we did, and I'll tell you an example. This study included surveys as well. It included eye tracking, included EEG. So it's a bigger study. You can download the full white paper on our website, which is trueimpact.ca. But now I want to tell you about how Pizza performed, because it was an interesting case. We asked people to use the app, and we gave them different stages in the navigation process. First, they had to open the app, and this was the discovery stage, which is when they were basically getting accustomed to the app. There was a selection stage where, in this case, they had to order a pizza. And then there was a checkout stage when they had to input their details and actually place the order. We asked people, what was your most preferred stage in this navigation process? And everyone said selection, meaning everyone agreed that choosing their pizza and their toppings was the most enjoyable thing for them to do. And most least favorite was checkout, which was not a surprise. I mean, it's more painful to pull out your wallet, put in your credit card, and actually pay for something than it is to choose toppings on a pizza. And what we also did during that time is we measured their brain activity during navigation of the application. So we tracked all these stages, and actually in a little bit more detail, we measured their emotional engagement. And we noticed, in fact, that it was the exact opposite of what they said. The engagement started on a low end. However, towards the end at checkout is when it ended on a very high note. And this was an interesting finding because when we compared it to the other apps, this was the only one that performed this way. So the checkout stage had the highest emotional engagement in this case. And here you can see how the other apps performed. There's Best Buy in the yellow and Hyatt in the blue line. And they all kind of declined in emotional engagement towards the end, particularly as people had to enter their information at the very end. You can see that emotional engagement is declining compared to the Pizza app, which is the only one performing differently. And what's also interesting to see is that this reaction that we noticed in the lab was actually correlated with the real world results. So on the App Store, you can see that the Pizza app is downloaded over 6,600 times and has almost a 5-star rating, I think, whereas the other two apps are not really performing as well in terms of rating and number of downloads. So this was interesting. Our observation was that feelings trump words. And, for someone like myself, that's not so much of a surprise anymore. But the recommendation, which is a big one actually at this point when you're designing mobile applications, is to really focus on reducing the hurdles at checkout. And the way Pizza Pizza did it was differently than the way the other apps did it. And here we only compared m-commerce apps, but having fewer fields or having images instead of text, easy to push big buttons, or flashing, so once you make your selection, making sure that that button flashes a little bit. Things like that, usability principles like that, make a huge difference in how many people use the app and how much they enjoy using the app, particularly at the stage where they hate, at the stage that they hate the most, that they say they dislike the most. So another interesting finding that came out of that study was don't make them wait. And this is an interesting one, because even though Pizza Pizza ended on a very high note, when the app opened up, it was on average, it took about 7.2 seconds to load, which is a fairly long time when you're waiting for an app to open compared to the previous ones. So, and that change was actually reflected, that difference was actually reflected in people's emotional engagement. The faster you can let people in to experience your app, the better. And here we can see eye tracking research that was done on the homepage of that app. So for Pizza Pizza, the promotion at the top was noticed right away. Also at the bottom, what that is at the bottom is actually a rotating carousel. And as soon as the carousel started moving, it grabbed people's attention. And for Best Buy as well, you can see the areas of visual focus. Unfortunately for Hyatt, it's interesting to study. Hyatt does a good job with its main image, which in that case is a father holding his son, kind of doing an airplane pose, I guess. People are very likely to look at faces. And just like we saw before with the shampoo bottle, when you add a face next to a product, it's competing for attention. So in this case, that image is emotionally engaging. However, the brand is not getting a lot of visual attention, and the promotions are not as well. So here we see the difference. When you don't let people in right away to experience the brand, there's a big difference in emotional engagement between the red line, which is Pizza Pizza, and the rest that loaded faster. So our observation was first impression, set the tone, and make sure you don't make them wait to experience your brand. Now, I want to talk about functional MRI. So that, we saw what EEG can do. EEG is portable, it's less expensive. It gives you a great idea of what people are feeling. If you want to know for sure what people are going to do, then you have to use what I call the Cadillac of neuroscience research, which is the MRI at this point in time. And the fMRI records blood oxygenation levels throughout the brain. And what that does is not only are we mapping the brain in 3 dimensions, but we can see how changes in blood flow occur by measuring where oxygen is flowing. So the principle here is, if an area is more active, then it requires more blood. The more blood you send to a region of the brain, the more oxygen it receives, and it will be picked up by this machine. So with the fMRI, we look for activation in certain regions of the brain. And, it's interesting that the brain anatomy is not a one-to-one. It's not like one region does only one thing. It's more like a network. It's a many-to-many network. So we look for activations in certain areas of the brain in particular order, such as the nucleus accumbens or the medial prefrontal cortex and amygdala and so on. These are regions of the brain that are part of a reward pathway, which is basically what activates in all our minds when we're doing something enjoyable. So if it's eating or gambling or whatever makes you feel great, your brain responds with an increase in activation in these particular areas. So those are the regions we want to know. What stimulates that feeling of reward in the brain? And ultimately, using this tool gives you a really accurate way of knowing what people are going to do. You can measure things like purchase intent. You can measure engagement, lust, familiarity, confusion, and many other emotions. More specific emotions, I mean. What's interesting is that the MRI can actually predict decisions. So back in 2007, I believe, at the Max Planck Institute, about 70 people were given a button board, and they were told to press either A or B. And it wasn't about which button they chose to press. It was about determining what they were going to do before they did it. So these people were put in an MRI. They were told to press each button, and their brain activity was recorded from the time when they decided to press the button to the time when they actually pressed the button. And what was interesting to see in the findings, now this comes straight out of the research, but I'll tell you what this means. What they found is actually that the brain has a delay in between the time when the emotional brain, the core of the brain, makes a decision and the logical brain clues in. And that delay is as much as 7 seconds. So basically, your emotional brain makes a decision as much as 7 seconds before your logical brain gets a chance to clue in. This has huge implications, and definitely, it raises questions about free will and so on, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but it's interesting to know that when we go out and we choose everything from the car we buy to what we order in a restaurant, it's a lot more driven by our gut feeling than we like to believe. And the fMRI is also a great tool for predicting what's going to be popular in the market. In this particular study, and this was done at the UCLA, participants were shown 3 commercials. They were shown 3 anti-smoking commercials, and they were told to say, they were told to rate them in order and actually choose the one they prefer the most. So they verbally chose campaign B, or commercial B. Now, they watched the commercial in the MRI, and their brain actually responded to commercial C. And what was interesting about the study is, first of all, we see a difference between what people say and how they truly feel, which is something we see quite often with neuromarketing research. But what's interesting to note is that when they went out into the market, they played all these commercials. And what was interesting to see is that commercials that were played in the market, actually, the results correlated with the fMRI results. They measured the call volumes into an anti-smoking hotline, and commercial C, the one predicted by the MRI, performed a lot better. And this was out in the market. This was not just for that sample of 100 or so people. It was mass population behavior. So that's the second interesting finding coming out of this study. Would you guys be interested to see the winning commercial? Okay.
Steve, are you smoking?
Yeah.
Didn't wait for you to go outside?
Meaning,
I don't see why you just quit.
do you think I'm right? I don't know what else I can do.
You're a finger, Steve. You can dial quit now for free information and please, Steve. Quitting is hard. Dialing 1-800-QUIT now is easy. If you're ready to try free information, one-on-one counseling.
Okay. So it's interesting to see, actually, I'm going to go back just a little bit to tell you about the reason why this was actually successful is because it appealed to our emotional part of the brain. I mean, it's fingers, but it's basically the wife telling the husband to quit, and outside it's raining, and she's sad and she sheds a tear. And this had a much higher emotional impact in people's minds than the other commercial they verbally chose, which I believe was one about the health adversities of smoking. So they verbally said, yes, you should go with that one because I know smoking is bad for me. But in fact, most people quit when a loved one really presses them to quit. So next I want to tell you about another case study that looked at the difference between digital and print, because a lot of neuromarketing research looks at a campaign, or it looks at which communication is best, but very rarely do we get a chance to study a channel of communication. So this particular example comes from the UK, and Royal Mail actually wanted to find out, is there a difference between physical media and virtual media? So what they did is, inside an MRI, they presented people with a digital image of, I believe it was landscape images, and actually giving them a postcard to hold. And you do that in an MRI. You can show people images using mirrors that are positioned right in front of their face, or you can give them a postcard to hold, which of course is possible since there's no metal involved in a direct mail piece. So they were able to study both media. And what was interesting to see is that the physical media, or the printed piece, had a much higher emotional engagement. What they found was actually that tangible materials are a lot more likely to become part of memory. And this had to do with the activation it had in certain regions in the temporal lobe. And they're much more likely to promote a positive brand association. So not only are they remembering what they're looking at a lot better, but their impression of the brand has changed and has improved as a result. So this is an interesting study because it really makes us wonder, well, when should we use print and when should we use digital? And that's a really big question. It would depend, obviously, from industry to industry and so on. But when it comes to conducting marketing communication activities, or sending out any message, it's good to take a look at what print can do, because it has a much different impact on the brain than something digital. So just to wrap it up a little bit, why do we care about neuroscience? At the end of the day, these sort of insights are the insights that can help you produce winning communications that are really optimized for people's brains. This is the only way to find out how people are truly feeling. These are insights otherwise unknown. And ultimately, by being able to predict group preferences, you have a much better chance at capturing a larger share of wallet.